welcome to Greatest Hits Foreign Policy Edition. All right, so obviously the place to start with foreign policy is isolationism. In George Washington's farewell address, this was one of his final wishes. He said, please stay out of Europe's wars. And America abides by that for a long time. Notably, we have an issue in the War of 1812 with Great Britain, and because they were impressing our sailors and trying to make them sail for them. We still do fight that war domestically, though, here in America. One of the big things to know with foreign policy is the Monroe Doctrine from 1824. This was James Monroe in the era of good feelings, famously saying, hey, Europe, you stay on your side of the world. The Western Hemisphere is ours. Don't come messing with any countries over here that could possibly affect our interests. Now, the Monroe Doctrine really doesn't matter at first. It's not going to matter until the Spanish-American War. There's not a lot of American foreign policy to know after the War of 1812 because most of our issues are domestic. Things like the Mexican-American War, in which we're fighting really over land that is right here in America or right on the border. America is so focused at this time on things like manifest destiny and claiming all of the land west for America. We're also focused on our sectional issues. So the Civil War takes the spotlight off of foreign policy up until the year 1898. 1898 is really America's first venture into interventionism, and we're going to stop the isolationist thing for just a small window in what will be called the Splendid Little War, a 5-month war in Cuba because of Spain's treatment of Cuba and because the USS Maine exploded under mysterious circumstances. Now remember, notably from that Spanish-American War, we get the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Going to help lead to the open door policy, which is one of our diplomatic policies established in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that calls for a system of equal trade and investment to guarantee the territorial integrity of China. Now, our involvement in China, in our trade with China, really without much of their say, is going to help lead to the Boxer Rebellion, which leads to anti-American, anti-Western sentiment in America is going to be violent. After the Spanish-American War, you get the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt famously is going to be concerned about the Caribbean. He wants to help spread American influence there. If that doesn't sound very isolationist, it's because it's not. So famously, Theodore Roosevelt advocates for big stick diplomacy. Speak softly and carry a big stick, particularly in the Caribbean. Don't go looking for issues, but if there are issues, don't be afraid to use the big stick on them. Now, this leads to him sending the Great White Fleet, our Navy, around the world to showcase that America is now at the big kids table. It also leads to us getting the Panama Canal, which eventually Jimmy Carter will give back in the 1970s. Now, following Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, you have dollar diplomacy that was advocated for by William Howard Taft. What dollar diplomacy was essentially invest money into the Caribbean so that they'll want to be in your sphere of influence. Of course, Woodrow Wilson is going to be very, very interested in getting America into World War I. We do not enter World War I until 1917 with the Zimmerman telegram. But once we are in World War I, Woodrow Wilson sees it as his opportunity to sort of set the peace terms. Remember that he has his idealistic 14 points in which he advocates for a bunch of things that the European countries really aren't interested in. One of the few things from his 14 points that does get passed is the League of Nations, but since that's so interventionist, America doesn't enter the League of Nations. We don't actually do that after World War I. Now from here, you're going to see the return to normalcy from 1920, post-World War I, all the way up until about 1941, where America is trying to stay out of World War II. But remember that Franklin Roosevelt, the president at the time, he has advocated for the Lend-Lease Act, where we are at least giving weapons to the countries that are fighting Hitler. But America has passed a series of acts that tie the president's hands on that. The neutrality acts don't allow America to enter. We enter, of course, because of Pearl Harbor. That leads to a new world order of sorts in which it is America and the Soviet Union, and this is, of course, the Cold War. The Cold War will shape American policy as we know it now, and it's going to be based on the fear of communism spreading. Of course, we have the Truman Doctrine, which will give troops and money to any countries fighting communism. This is important because of Turkey and Greece, who were in that exact situation. Also, the Marshall Plan, which will give money to countries in rebuilding their economies after World War II so that they don't fall to communism. Remember that the Truman Doctrine is kind of like a band-aid for a wound that's already happened, whereas the Marshall Plan is kind of like antibiotics to prevent you from getting sick again. Remember that Cold War foreign policy at this time is the domino theory, that if one small country falls to communism, then all the rest will soon fall to communism as well. This leads to our theory of containment, which is keep communism where it is. Don't go try to root it out, but if a small country falls, you need to go save it. Remember that Russia has been communist since 1917, but China also falls to communism in 1949. North Korea is communist per the peace agreement of World War II, and they invade South Korea in 1950. That leads to the Korean War or the Korean conflict, depending on who you ask, from 1950 to 1953, in which a UN army led by the United States goes and fights and ends in a tie that still exists today with North and South Korea. Presidents of this time, they had different ideas on how to handle the domino theory, on how to handle containment. Notably, Dwight Eisenhower had the Eisenhower Doctrine, which was kind of like the Truman Doctrine, but for the Middle Eastern countries. Eisenhower advocated for what he called massive retaliation. Basically, if communist countries step out just 1 inch, that we would be willing to use atomic weapons. Now, Eisenhower had been a great general, and really, countries don't mess with Eisenhower very much. But once Eisenhower is leaving office, he gives his military-industrial complex speech, in which he just urges America and he urges the government not to spend so much money on defense because it's going to spend us to death. JFK, following Eisenhower, advocated for flexible response. Basically, whatever your enemy does, be willing to meet that, rather than having to do the rigid, massive retaliation thing. Now, following JFK, you have Lyndon Johnson, who involves America in the Vietnam War, but then you also have détente, Richard Nixon, who was an established anti-communist. Everybody knew this guy wasn't a communist, so he was able to go and negotiate with communists. And he goes through a period, he puts America through a period called détente, in which we have a thawing of relations through things like the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement with the Soviet Union. Also, Nixon goes and negotiates in China and essentially opens up and normalizes relations with China. Remember that Ronald Reagan applied a ton of pressure to the Soviet Union. He famously had his Star Wars anti-missile system, and eventually the Soviet Union is going to fall. Ronald Reagan famously gives his Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall speech. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, you're really going to get more of an eye on terrorism with things like the Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, the Iraq War, 9/11, and things like that. Only Jesus. Only Jesus.